People in the back, can you hear me? Wonderful. Boy, Lena Feiner, she can still draw a crowd, can't she? Thank you everyone so much for being here tonight. Some new faces tonight. I'm Ryan Rakicki, the director of the Working Men's Institute, and it's such a treat to have this lecture here tonight. Of course, we're hearing from a recipient of the 2023 Arlene Feiner Memorial Grant for Women's Studies. And these crowds are great for these lectures. We want to thank, of course, champion of women's rights, New Harmony friend, Lena Feiner. We all remember her, we all miss her. She was such a force here in New Harmony for so long. Go ahead, Miss Maudlin, go ahead. She deserves it. We also want to thank Jeremy Ephraimson and the Ephraimson Family Fund for supporting this program, this series of grants that we've been able to have for the last few years and for a few more years in the future. And of course also Phyllis Feiner, who has supported, Lena's sister, who has supported this as well. Tonight's speaker, Rebecca May Hope. She is an adjunct English professor at the University of Northwestern, that's in the Twin Cities, St. Paul to be specific. She's also the executive director of the Mid-Metro Academy, a homeschool academy in Roseville, Minnesota. Her writing has won awards and honors in multiple genres: novel, novella, short story, poetry, and memoir. Her long works include a contemporary novella that won first place in the American Christian Fiction Writers' First Impressions Contest in 2018. She has written 2 historical novels, including Destination Harmony, which depicts New Harmony's Owenite community in 1826. Rebecca received the Arlene Feiner Memorial Research Grant for Women's Studies in 2023, and she's been to New Harmony twice during research and is here to present her findings tonight. So let's give a nice New Harmony welcome, Rebecca May Hope.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you. And thank you for everyone coming out here tonight. It's so fun to see everyone. I also want to thank the Arlene Feiner Grant Committee for selecting my project and some people who helped me with my research a couple times when I was here, Linda and Melora, and I don't know, is Professor Kimberling here tonight? I thought that might be you. So thank you. We corresponded with email, and other people who helped me with my research, thank you. And thank you all for coming out to hear about the Women of Paradise, the legacy of the 15 female boatloaders. So, as you might know, in 1825, Robert Owen, a Scottish industrialist, brought a boatload of other of important people, scientists, scholars, teachers, and artists to join him on the frontier of Indiana, and their goal was to create a community of cooperation that could produce far more than the individual private system was achieving in the rest of the world. So they set out to build utopia. They left Philadelphia first and went down to Pittsburgh. They intended to take steamboats, a steamboat down the river, and they found out that the steamboat stopped running for the season. And so, not to be deterred, geologist William McClure, who was one of the scientists coming on the boat, he hired John Beale to construct the keel boat, as you see, and named Philanthropist. And 40 people rode on the boat, and 15 of them were women. Well, no sooner had they left Pittsburgh, about 3 days out, they got stuck in the ice. And, well, it was December. And they were scientists, and maybe they should have known that. But at any rate, At any rate, they were stuck there for a month. It was crowded. This boat was 85 feet long and 14 feet wide, and they had about 10 boys, ages, 8 to 12 on that boat. And the fact that Lesueur, one of the artists and naturalists on the boat, called their quarters purgatory might give you a clue of what it was like. The women, though, slept in paradise, and thus my project, Women of Paradise. Some couldn't take it, and they left, but those who stayed found that their nerves were frayed, their friendships were strained, there were injuries and accidents and hunger by the time they managed to cut their way out with a channel through the ice and get headed down the river about a month later. Well, word was spreading. Someone in here in New Harmony already said that Robert Owen was bringing more learning than was ever contained in a boat. And that's how the Boatload of Knowledge got its name. Well, they stopped at Cincinnati and Louisville, and they actually took the whole keelboat down the falls of the Ohio, which did not have a channel and locks and dams like it has now. That's what it looked like. On January 23rd, 1826, they arrived in Mount Vernon and came overland to New Harmony. Well, I was so fascinated by this whole idea of a boatload of knowledge. I want some of that. And the whole utopian idea fascinated me. So I wrote a novel, Destination Harmony, about what happened. It begins with the Philanthropist being frozen in the ice, and it recreates the Owenite period through the end of the communal period. The events and people come alive as never before, and it's like being there. Well, here are our 13 of our 15 women and girls of paradise. We have Virginia Dupolet, Hannah Fisher-Price with her baby Caroline, Sally Turner, Roxanne Beale with her baby Caroline, two baby Carolines, Madame Fredigeau, Lucy Sister, and her sisters, Sarah and Frances Sister. These two little ones are Hannah's girls, Emily and Sarah, and here's little Cecilia Noel, just 2 years old. Not pictured were Helen Fisher. She was one who couldn't handle the keelboat and got off early. And Eugenie was a maid and a nurse for Cecilia, and she's not pictured. Well, did they find utopia in New Harmony, or did they build utopia in New Harmony? In a word, no. It was chaos. It was a lot of dissension, and the town abandoned the communitarian experiment by June of 1827, just 18 months after the boatloaders arrived. Some of the women and girls left before the ending of that period, and some stayed on to contribute to the town. When I started studying utopias, the big question in my mind, because I was so fascinated that there were like over 100 of these utopian experiments all across America in the 1800s. Why then? Why not now? Why do we not see little utopian communities popping up everywhere? And was that utopian vision and spirit channeled somewhere else? And I was so pleased as I did this research to find that yes, they didn't build utopia that way, but that utopian desire to improve life and to influence their world for the better lived on. And it shines across 2 centuries down to us today. So especially when it comes to the female boatloaders, they and their descendants left an indelible mark on New Harmony, the region, the country, and indeed the world. So though they didn't achieve utopia, they improved society in many ways. And we'll hear about that tonight. But first, before we get into that, let's stop to consider, ponder, tracing a legacy. What does that mean? Well, a legacy is a long-lasting impact of somebody's actions or of a person's life. And it can include, as we'll discuss tonight, the descendants that follow on from that person, because we do influence those who come after us. But as we consider tracing a legacy, we see that it's a weighty matter. It's a deeply personal and private matter, and it's a formidable challenge. Well, it's a weighty matter because as we start to think about a legacy, what do we talk when we're talking about leaving something and being remembered? Well, it causes us to face our mortality. First of all, we're not going to always be here, and it causes us to assess our priorities and clarify our values. Well, that's going to lead us to questions about fate, destiny, free will, relationships, the meaning of life and history, the Creator, faith, the afterlife, and eternity. Weighty and very personal and deeply private, things that we all ponder and struggle with ourselves. So it's a formidable challenge even to think about our own personal legacy. But what about in analyzing a legacy of people who lived 200 years ago? Because there's always a value judgment with a legacy. And we don't want to put on them a value judgment maybe that they didn't have, right? Like, say, imposing a modern system of values on people that lived in a completely different mindset. So we don't want to do that. So, but yet there is value. There are a lot of benefits of pondering a legacy. And those, as I considered it, I put into three things that we get from pondering a legacy: gratitude, inspiration, and justice. Gratitude because we appreciate the efforts to build a better world that these women put into their spheres of influence. And we appreciate them because they did it without the modern conveniences that we have now and without the freedoms that we enjoy. We can also take inspiration from them because they overcame hardships and sacrificed to make a difference. Well, the larger-than-life people that we read about in history books or we see monuments created to them, yes, they're inspirational, but maybe even more so, everyday people that we can learn about and what they did, because we can relate to them and take even greater inspiration from their legacies. And it's also just a matter of doing what's right, which is I summed up in justice, because we say, do unto others as you'd have them to do unto you. Well, if we hope people are going to remember us when we're gone, then it's only right for us to remember the people who've gone on before. And we say, give honor to whom honor is due. These women deserve recognition. And thanks to the Arlene Feiner grant, we are going to be honoring some of those women who haven't yet been duly celebrated. I divided the legacies that I was able to uncover into three categories: lost legacies, local legacies, and long-distance legacies. So that's how we'll cover them. Some of the people, but surprisingly few actually, I was not able to uncover much about. And those were Helen Grigorowski Fisher, the one who got off the boat early, Eugenie the maid, and Caroline Price, the baby Caroline, the first baby Caroline. She died when she was 29. I just couldn't uncover much about her. I thought that Sally Turner was one. I did put her in the Lost Legacies, but I actually ended up finding more about her than I thought. I made her the main character of my novel because I couldn't find anything about her at first, and I thought she was a blank slate. And so she became the main character of my novel, but later I learned more about the real Sally Turner. So my novel is an alternate history of the real Sally Turner, but nevertheless, I chose her. Well, who was the real Sally Turner? And you should have seen me jumping around the house and calling my best friend and screaming and yelling when I found out who the real Sally Turner was, because I did a lot of sleuthing to find her. Well, she was a mother's helper to Hannah. She was a good friend of Hannah, the one who had the 3 girls on the boat. Hannah wrote that she pleased all parties. Sally was a party girl. She liked all the interaction between the men and women at New Harmony. She loved the dances. But as much as she liked it here, she left New Harmony for the prairies, the English prairies in Albion, when the Prices left. And then she went with them to Cincinnati, and from there, she ended up going to Short Creek, Ohio, and marrying a man named Linton Wharton. They had 4 children. After the children were grown, they moved to Iowa as homesteaders. I was able to track down her grave in a very tiny cemetery in Keokuk, Iowa. And I believe it's a little bit of a metaphor or symbol of legacies of many people. You know, when we're gone, there would be a lonely cemetery. In this case, it's eroding, and there's only a few graves left marked there. And, you know, a lone little marker. But what I was able to find was that her grandchildren put an obituary in the newspaper, and it's so lovely. And here it is. Her life was rounded full with good acts and deeds of charity. She ever felt that she had much to thank God for, and with gratitude she appreciated the mercy thrown round her. So time in his flight wafted her on till she realized the end was near. Yet her faith in her master never wavered, and hope grew brighter day by day. As the end drew near, she said, I am about to try the future world, and oh, I am so anxious to go. Only waiting here for the summons. Grandma was gone to join loved ones on that forever bright shore. Now we'll get into the local legacies. There are 2 women very well known in New Harmony, Madame and Lucy Say. So I'm not going to talk a lot about them tonight because you can find out about them from other sources, but we can't skip over them either. They were very important. So Madame Marie de Classe Fretigeau was a Pestalozzian instructor, an amazing mathematician, an administrator par excellence, and a true believer in socialism. She was all on the Robert Owen bandwagon and more. But as soon as the socialist system failed, she was all in on capitalism. She was a stellar capitalist and an amazing businesswoman. She was a controversial figure. She butted heads with most everybody in New Harmony, and one of them with whom she did not get along very well was Charles Lesueur, the artist. And you can tell if you do know French, because what she is pointing to, this is Lesueur's drawing of Madame, it says, "Fathead, can't you hear me?" Which I guess is the way he thought she instructed her pupils. But McClure would not have anybody else put in charge of his affairs when he left. It had to be Madame. And she did a really good job. But personal needs required her to go to France, she thought temporarily. So she left in 1831 and stopped in Mexico to visit McClure on her way back, and died, sadly, in Mexico. But her legacy is all around us. Without her persuasion, McClure would not have made the journey, and there would have been no Boatload of Knowledge. She deserves credit for the boatload and at least half of the good things that came out of that Owenite period here. Without her astute management, McClure's legacy in New Harmony would not have endured. So much of what you see around you, this amazing building, and this town can be traced to Madame and her very high standards. Our next local legacy is Cecilia Noel. Remember the little 2-year-old in the corner of that picture? She traveled with Lesueur Well, one might ask, why would a famous explorer, artist, and naturalist bring a 2-year-old with him as his ward to New Harmony? There's some speculation by a biographer that Cecilia was his daughter, born to Sophia Dupillet, who was the older sister of Virginia and the two boy Dupillet brothers who came also on the boatload. So that means Virginia was her aunt. Virginia and her husband raised Cecilia until she was of marriageable age, being 16. So she married a fellow boatloader, Achille Fredigeau, Madame's son. He was 11 years older than she was, but they married in 1839. Tragically, she died at the young age of 30, leaving behind 4 motherless children. Here's the community number 2, which we all know, and that was during Madame's time and after a retail establishment, and 5 generations of Fredigeaus operated that retail concerns in that building. Continuing with Cecilia, she had 6 children. 2 of them died in childhood. Alexander died in the Civil War, and that left Achilles, Eliza, who was called Ida, and Oliver. Achilles went into business and took over the store. His son, Arthur, is shown here, the next generation who took over the retail work, and he's shown with his daughter, Mary. Achilles was a pretty amazing guy. I'll tell some more stories about him at the Talking History tour tomorrow, if you can come to that. Mary studied at the Sorbonne in Paris when she grew up. She married Joseph Hodge and lived here in New Harmony until her death in 1976. And Ida moved to Sacramento, married a doctor, talk about her in a minute, and Captain O.N. Fredigeau ran the Wabash Ferry in Mount Vernon and ran the newspaper there for a while. A little bit more about Cecilia. So after she died, Achille remarried, and these are the 3 older ones are Cecilia's children who survived at this point, 1867. And then Achille remarried, and then he had 6 girls, 6 other girls. 5 of them are pictured here. So the little ones are from his second marriage. But Cecilia's children, Ida went to California. They were very influential people there. Her husband was a physician. Her son was a physician who served as a VP of the California State Board of Health for 14 years. And her daughter, Eloise, was a renowned speaker in the area and a world traveler. So though Cecilia's life was tragically cut short, and 3 of her children's lives were as well, she left an enduring legacy in New Harmony and out in California, Sacramento. Here's our next local legacy, Roxy Beale. I won't talk much about her now, but on the tram tour, we'll talk a lot more about her. McClure hired her husband, John, to build that keelboat, and then they came along as housekeepers to help manage the affairs on the keelboat. She was only 18 years old, and she had a 10-month-old baby, so she'd gotten an early start. They lived in 3 different houses here in New Harmony, 2 of which John built. They were very close with Achille Fredigeau. Well, one thing that was very curious to me is why the men folk left the women folk in 1849. They were gone for the 1850 census. Everything was in the women's names, and then they came back. Oh, what could that have been? 1849? You got it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that on the tram tour. One of Roxy's daughters, Marianne, married Charles Slater. He was the editor. He ran the newspaper here before and after he served in the Civil War. Then they had a son, Harry Truman, who went by the name of Nick Slater, who is pictured here. Oops, sorry. Pictured here. I love this picture. He took over the newspaper, and that is the press that is still preserved on the third floor of community number 2. And he's got a couple of things he donated to the museum here, the cribbage board and the whistle. Roxy's other child was Caroline. She was the baby Caroline, the other baby Caroline on the boat. And at some point, the Beals moved a little bit farther out of town toward where the Charles Ford Community Center, Retirement Centers is right now. And they had an orchard. And next to them were the Lichtenbergers. And Caroline ended up marrying Adam Lichtenberger, and they had 3 daughters. Adam served as on some state and local offices, and their two of their daughters, Mary and Eliza, married 2 of the Ford sons. Get that right. William and George. Who were the Fords? They were grandsons of the people who started the English prairies of Wanborough. If you know, when I talk about the English prairies, I'm talking about Wanborough and Albion, Illinois, which were kind of sister communities to New Harmony. So the last part of their line came to New Harmony, who stayed in the U.S. Others went to Australia. But their part of the line came here, and what's so cool is Caroline Beal was born the same year that the grandmother of, I'm getting into too deep of weeds. Anyway, what I just want to say is that the lines of the English prairie utopias and the boatloaders melded when these 2 families married. Then there's the retirement centers. That was a different Ford brother, Charles Ford. He was related to them. But they were all very close, and in a way they had kind of their own little community within the Ford family, and the Lichtenbergers and the Slaters. They were all very close, lived close together and did things together. Another local legacy is Lucy Sester Say. She's our other well-known woman. She was Madame's assistant. That's why she came here, to help Madame with the schools. She studied drawing under Lesueur and was an amazing artist. She fell in love with Thomas Say and married him a year after they got to New Harmony. And she was the one who did almost all the illustrations for his definitive work, American Conchology. He documented all the shells in North America, right? And she drew all the pictures of all the shells in North America. There were 300 illustrations, and she did like the vast majority of them. And not only that, but she hand-colored them so that these volumes could be distributed in color. After Thomas died, he died pretty young in 1834, then Lucy returned to New York, and she donated all the specimens to the the Academy of Natural Sciences, and she spent a lot of her life, the rest of her life, trying to make sure that all of Thomas's work was adequately published and represented. And she was honored as the first woman to be admitted as a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences, so she did receive some recognition. Our next local legacy is Virginia Dupelet Twigg. She was Lesueur's ward, and as I mentioned, and she herself was a talented artist and musician. This is a drawing from Lesueur. I believe it represents when Duke Bernard came to New Harmony in 1826 in April, and he had stories to tell about Virginia, but he was most impressed with Virginia, of all the people he met, all the women he met here. She married an English immigrant in 1828 after the communal period, and they stayed in town. They started the St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, and they moved out of the town to a farm on the outskirts. I believe it's the site where Premier Healthcare is right now. She was an amazing artist. And a musician. So when these traveling naturalists would come to town, one of them was Prince Maximilian came, and he stayed with them, and she sketched his portrait. She sketched Fanny Wright's portrait, and this is labeled as a man at New Harmony, but it's certainly Thomas Say. Completely looks like Thomas Say. She also invested in the plank road. If you've ever seen this marker around on one of the side roads, there was a wooden road. This was like the big new thing that was going to transform transportation, building roads out of wood so that the horses couldn't get stuck in the mud, right? And so she was one of the first investors in the plank road that went from here to Mount Vernon. She had 8 children of her own, only 2 grandchildren, and then no descendants after that, so her line did not go on very long. But let's talk about her descendants. Her oldest son went to the gold fields. Her daughter, Eliza, was a music teacher, and I have Thrall's Opera House here because she performed concerts there later in life. Her 3 sons were painters, and by that I do not mean artistic painters. They were house and carriage painters. That's how they supported themselves. But still, I think that artistic bent from their mother came through. And then she had 2 little girls who died at young ages, at the tail end of her children. 3 of her sons had important roles in the Civil War. 2 of them joined the military band when they were recruiting for the Civil War, and that was an important role. And then William did that, and Alexander. And then Alexander re-enlisted as an officer in 1864, and Robert enlisted, he was younger, he enlisted as a bugler in 1863. Both Alexander and Robert, from what I could tell, helped build this Sulphur Creek trestle, which was taken over by the Confederates, and everybody was captured after it was built. So they went to POW camps, different camps, and mustered out at Vicksburg. Alexander, unfortunately, mustered out first. And I say unfortunately because that meant he was one of the soldiers who got onto the Sultana, the overcrowded Sultana, which exploded, the boiler exploded. It was the largest, still is, the biggest maritime disaster in U.S. history. And their son, Alexander, perished in that. Kind of a blessing that Virginia did not live to see that, because can you imagine waiting to have your son come home from the war and then have him die this way. Robert was wounded in the Battle of Nashville, and he came back a little later and went back to carriage painting. And William married and lived in New Harmony with his wife and his 2 children for a couple of decades until they relocated to Los Angeles in 1907. Let's talk about the 2 grandchildren now of Virginia. So William was the only one who had surviving children, and he had a son and a daughter. Alexander Gilbert Twigg, I think he was a very gregarious and engaging young man. He traveled across the country as a salesman. He was very successful. He was bringing his family members on world tours. Around they traveled in Europe and Egypt and so on. So he was very successful. Well, he married very well. He married the daughter of a millionaire. And he had a very big scheme in mind to capture the nation's apple market. And so he bought 4,000 acres of land outside Washington, D.C., and he was going to you could subscribe to it. You could get 5 acres of that. And he was going to capture the apple market that way. Unfortunately, it was an epic failure. And he was so depressed about the financial losses that he attempted to take his life. He was not successful. And he went back and lived 1 more year in Los Angeles with his parents and sister. Virginia, so this is the granddaughter, Virginia's granddaughter, Virginia Louise Twigg. She was also an amazing woman. She was active in New Harmony social life and in Los Angeles when they moved there. She was a musician, a writer, and a historian. She made good efforts to document the history of New Harmony. So a lot of things we know about her parents and their era, and the church especially, we owe to Virginia. She was, don't be mad at her, she was an early telephone fundraiser. In 1918, she was doing telemarketing to raise funds for Los Angeles' Friday Morning Club. And she was very successful with that. She also lectured about Dickens and old musical instruments and history. She frequently came back here from Los Angeles to New Harmony. She was very good friends with the A.C. Thomases and would stay with them when she came back. Now we're getting into the long-distance legacies, the people who moved away. Frances Sister Ball, so remember the 2 girls in the middle, Lucy's sisters. The older one was Frances. Both of those girls came as Madame Fredigeau's students. That's why they came. And they were corresponding with their mother in New York, and she kind of didn't like it when she got wind of some of the things that were happening here. And so she brought them back even before the end of the communal period. Frances married a prominent New York City jeweler. His name was Henry Ball, and he was of the jewelry company Ball, Black and Company. This is the longest continuously running jewelry concern in the country, and it's still going. And this building that I have here, when they built this building, it was a very cutting-edge building for multiple reasons. You could look it up if you want. But he was very much at the top of his profession. For her part, Frances had the gift of hospitality. She took in a niece and a nephew after their parents died into her home. She had this beautiful home on the Hudson River in New York. It was not this one. I couldn't find a picture of her home on the Hudson. But she took in them, she took in her aunt, and she took in Lucy Say. Lucy Say went to live with them for quite a while as well. So she had just this warm heart of making a place for people. In 1874, she and her husband designed this beautiful mansion in St. Augustine, Florida. They intended to retire down there. Unfortunately, before they could move down there, Henry passed away. So this this house became the Barcelona Hotel, which I think is just a lovely, fitting tribute for someone who had the gift of hospitality, that this home that she put her heart and her skill into designing would become a hotel where many people could visit and be blessed. Sarah, the younger of the sisters, was only 8, and she married, when she was 18, a man named William Kobe. He became a diplomat to an area of Germany, like around Prussia, and they had 7 sons and 1 daughter. All of these sons were amazing in their fields, in law and in business. Philip Ferdinand was VP of Westinghouse. Walter, their 5th son, was a silk importer. There was a line of silks known as bonnet silks. And if you think about that, you might think they're silks for making bonnets. No, they were silks from the company of Bonnet, Kobe and Company, because Bonnet was Kobe's partner. So Walter Kobe transited the Atlantic Ocean 110 times buying silk. That's a lot of times to be riding ships across the ocean. their oldest son was very renowned for his military work. So he served in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, and then he actually was made military governor for a couple of months in the Philippines in 1901, which was a very great honor. And also he was awarded with the French Legion of Honor decoration by the French president. Fort Kobe in the former U.S. Panama Canal Zone was named for him, Fort Kobe. And he retired to Pasadena when he got out of the military, and he was such a beloved person in Pasadena. He ran for local office, and anytime there was a Memorial Day parade, he was right out front in all his medals, and really promoting patriotism and veterans of the wars. Now, another son of Sarah was Herman, and he had a little bit different role to play in international relations. He was, in the 1870s, on the side of the Cubans who were trying to overthrow the rule of Spain, and he thought it would be a good idea to get weapons to them so that they could overthrow their Spanish rulers. So he had a boat built. This was an amazing boat called Baby Estelle. It's this one. It was very fast, one of the fastest boats of its time, and he intended to do arms running to Cuba with this boat. Well, the U.S. government found out about it, and they sent their own ship to keep close watch on Baby Estelle, and before she could leave on her maiden journey, they impounded her. Well, she became an obedient mail ship, and later a tugboat at the mouth of the Mississippi, and boy, could she tug. She could tug about 5 boats at a time up the Mississippi River. Sarah's next son was George Christian Kobe. He was very brilliant, valedictorian of Columbia, began practicing law at 24. His law partner was the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. Their firm was Roosevelt and Kobe. In 1877, he co-founded the Seabright Lawn Tennis and Cricket Club, which is still there in Rumson, New Jersey. Their last son, Sarah's last son, was Gustav, and he, if possible, was even more brilliant and more talented than the previous brothers. At age 10, Sarah sent him to Germany to study musical composition and piano. He earned multiple degrees from Columbia when he came back to the U.S. He was a prolific writer of articles, stories, and books. He was an art critic for 18 years for a New York newspaper. He wrote about drama, art, music, and opera. He had map books and travel guides that he created and published, which are very important now to show us what life was like in that time. He, very interestingly, his legacy passed down to a grandson who was a musical performer and composer, and a great-great-grandson of actor Justin Thoreau. If you recognize him, he's a modern-day actor. So I love the way that his passions of art and drama, continued down this line, and this very masculine and becoming nose also continued along the generations, right? But I'm just so amazed about these sons of Sarah Kobe, and I think of her being Madame's pupil. Remember Madame's high standards? And Sarah was her pupil in those formative years of 8 to 11 years old. I think she absorbed a lot of Madame Frédéric. And she passed that on to her sons, held them to high standards, and they did amazing things in their spheres. All right, now we're coming to Hannah Fisher Price. I love this woman. She herself came from an impressive line. This was her parents were prominent Philadelphia Quakers, and her father interacted with founding fathers like George Washington and John Adams. She, in 1820, married Philip Price, who was also from a very prominent line of Philadelphia Quakers, and they ended up moving to England so that William could get more medical training. And they brought their daughter Emily with them, and they had 2 more daughters when they were over there. Also, while they were there, William took a chance to go to Scotland and visit Robert Owen's factory in New Lanark. And he came away a believer. He was totally on board with Robert Owen. So when he got back, they got back to the States in 1824. He started introducing Robert Owen to everybody he knew in Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C. William's younger brother Philip, was also caught the Owen bug, and he actually came out here before the boatload arrived. He was out here by October 1825. So William, Hannah, and their daughters came on the keelboat, but her motivation was just to provide a good education for her girls. But when she got here, she found out that she was extremely overworked. She became disillusioned. William became disillusioned pretty quickly. And they left for the prairies. They spent a little bit of time there. They were hoping maybe they could make it work on a more limited basis, the communal system. But they gave it up, and they went to Cincinnati. When Hannah got to Cincinnati, she wrote to a friend, "My hands are so stiff that I can barely feel my pen. I worked so hard at Harmony." And then she also wrote, "William is quite cured of communities, so that I do not regret the last year's pilgrimage in the least." The thing that she got out of New Harmony was to cure her husband of that commitment to these socialist communities, and that was enough. So they moved to Cincinnati. This is a picture. If you see here this balloon, this is a picture of the Ohio River and how it looked when they lived there, when they came. This is a very early photograph, right, in the 1830s. They lived in this boarding house right there on the river. And that was very puzzling to me, because I knew how successful the Fisher clan and the Price clan were in Philadelphia. Very prominent business people, very successful, and on the wealthy side for sure. And so why did they live for a couple of decades in this bad part of town in a boarding house? Well, I found the book of the Fisher genealogy had an explanation for that. It said, residing so near Kentucky, and their benevolence and charity being well known, and many slaves came to the house for aid and shelter in their efforts to obtain freedom. It was well known that Dr. and Mrs. Price would furnish them with food, clothing, and conveyance to help them on their way to Canada. Isn't that amazing? So they were, if you can see, here's the river. On this side would be Kentucky, a slave state. And so the freedom seekers who would swim across, if they could get across the river, they get up the bank. First house they come to, William and Hannah Price. We're going to keep you safe. We're going to give you some food. We're going to get you on your way to freedom in Canada. Pretty amazing. Well, Lucy Say visited them at this boarding house in 1834, and they already had 7 daughters, and she was like, wow. But she was very impressed with the way they were raising their daughters and the educational institution they had found for their daughters, which was Dr. Locke's school. And it had a preparatory program for girls to get a 4-year certificate that showed, they had basically learned what the boys were learning. So they were really training their girls fully and educating them. They were also very much involved in music. Cincinnati, we just came from there. It's a big music city, if you know anything about that. And they became involved with music there. And then in 1836, they got a boy, finally. So they also supported other charitable causes there in Cincinnati, hospitals and orphanages and women's homes. And William was a state rep for a while, and he was advocating for public education. But during the 1850 cholera epidemic, he was back in Cincinnati with his family and serving patients. And Hannah pitched in. So she would go to the homes of the sick patients, sick with cholera, and help the nurses who were serving the families in those homes. And unfortunately, because of that, she was exposed to the impure water and contracted cholera herself. And she died in 1850. I have a digital copy of the letter that William Price was composing as she was dying and right after her death. And this is what he wrote about her. The mortal tenement of the loved one only remains to us. Her spirit is with the God who gave it. The vital spark ascended to heaven, her dying pillow surrounded by her weeping family and a few friends who she loved most. She has been to me the most devoted and self-sacrificing wife, and to her children the most exemplary and best of mothers. How we shall miss her and feel the want of her cheerful and animating presence. I know. She left behind her 8 children and her husband, but her children carried on her legacy in amazing ways, which we'll see now. Emily Price Marshall, she was the oldest of the 3 girls on the keel boat, so she was a boatloader. She was 29 when her mom died. She moved to San Francisco in 1861, married a man who came from Cincinnati as well. In 1888, they invested in 4 lots in the Russian Hill neighborhood, and they were friends with a man named Reverend Wooster, who was an amateur architect. And he laid out and designed for them 4 cozy cottages, 2 of which still stand. And they were the first structures built in what is known as the first Bay Area tradition of home design. This transformed the look of San Francisco neighborhoods for generations. So these 2 little houses, backed up to the skyscraper there, are multi-million dollar properties now and on the Register of Historic Places. So this Reverend Wooster was a very important person. Emily was very close with him. There was the Wooster group of famous authors and artists that lived in Vallejo Street or came to meet with Wooster. He rented one of those cottages. And he was a pioneer and a guiding light of the American arts and crafts movement. And that is having things that are not so fancy, but where things take a more natural look. And that started back then in San Francisco. And in 1895, he had his Swedenborgian church built here, which you can still go and see. And these are the original chairs, which are still there. And they were the prototype. They were the first mission-style furniture. And the seats are woven rush seats, and members of the congregation there wove those seats. So I like to believe that Emily herself wove some of those seats, and you can still go there, and those chairs are still there. And in her will, she left a bequest for Reverend Wooster so he could continue his work, and also for the upkeep of the garden of this little church, as well as some other things she left legacies for. The next daughter, Sarah, she was also on the keel boat. She married a German merchant, and he composed a song for her on their on proposing to her. Now that's pretty great. And he had this portrait commission of her. That's the sheet music. They raised their children in Europe. Their oldest daughter, Regina, married a man named Iungarik, and he had 2 children. One became a Swedenborgian minister, and his daughter, Helene, she was an artist, a painter. She exhibited her paintings in New York and in Massachusetts and in Philadelphia, and she was part of the Provincetown Players Group, if you know anything about them. So Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, was part of that, and Charles Demuth, the artist, who supposedly had a big crush on Helene. Well, you can see why. Now, Sarah's other daughter was Natalie Townsend, and she is very famous in her own right. She was born in Paris. She married, but she came back to Philadelphia to get her husband, and she found a second cousin of the Quaker clan to marry, and he wanted to be a diplomat. So they moved back to Europe, and they were in the diplomatic service for years. And as they were doing that, they hobnobbed with the rich, famous, and noble of Europe, including Isabel Stewart Gardner, who has the Gardner Museum, Art Museum in Boston, if you've heard of that. And Mrs. Gardner would invite her top friends to come and stay with them in the summer right on the canal in Venice. And so the Townsends, Natalie got to go. And then the next year, she invited Isabella to come to their summer retreat in Austria. And I don't know if Isabella came or not, but they have the letter at the Gardner Museum from Natalie. But Natalie, while she was here, I guess she thought it was a good time that summer to get her grand piano. And she moved it over the Austrian Alps down into this little nook to this little chalet they had rented. But she was very serious about learning music, and she did. Became a good musician, amazing musician. So she was a music educator, singer, musician, and composer. After 1906, they moved back to Washington, D.C., and she started doing these musicales in Washington, D.C. Over 19 years, she hosted 123 musicales where famous singers and violinists and pianists and internationally known musicians would come, and she would host these events. And she gave many musicians their start. And they were premier gatherings for socialites and foreign visitors. But just imagine that in Washington, D.C., which could be a very partisan and bickering kind of place, but for 2 hours on a Thursday, everyone can go to the Mayflower Hotel and sit and listen to gorgeous music, and you can all be friends for 2 hours. Wouldn't that be great? And that's what she did for the country. And there were international people there visiting Washington, D.C. So really, she spread a lot of good feeling over 19 years. Here she is with one of the most important, famous sopranos of the 20th century. All right, another daughter was Henrietta Wright. She was in Philadelphia, and she was involved with all kinds of charitable causes, and she worked with Benjamin Franklin's great-granddaughter on a lot of those causes. She had some influential children herself. Mears Fisher was a Navy man who kind of went all over the world and explored the Amazon as he served the Navy, inspected the Panama Canal. But this young man, Robert Kemp Wright, at just the age of 27, he was the consul to Aspinwall, which was Panama. And that was during the time when there was this great big uprising, and the city of Cologne was actually burned to the ground. Well, right before that happened, he and 2 other people were taken hostage at gunpoint. And Robert had to use his wits to get free and to get his friends free. And he managed to escape to the USS Galena, which was there trying to calm things down. They were unable to keep Cologne from burning to the ground, unfortunately. Hannah's daughter, Helene, was very involved in the music scene in Cincinnati. She and her husband were involved with that, and she was very prominent in the Catholic circles, considered among the city's most prominent Catholic women. The newspaper wrote of her, one of the most loved and lovable women, Madame Molinier, was regarded as almost saint-like in her manner and mode of living, and her children reverenced her. Now, her son had a national and international impact as the founder of the Catholic Hospital Association. At that time in 1910, they had this Carnegie report had come out that said that there were too many people who were practicing medicine that didn't know what they were doing, and so they wanted to standardize it. But they couldn't standardize it unless they had the buy-in of the Catholics, because there were 600 Catholic hospitals around the country. So if you're going to standardize, you've got to include the Catholics. And so Father Molinier got on board with that, and he founded the Catholic Hospital Association and went around the country promoting the standardization of hospital care. And you might think, well, that sounds like sanitation and procedures and stuff like that, but that's not what he emphasized. If you think back to his mother Hannah serving those sick people during the cholera epidemic, that's what he wanted healthcare to be. Not that, it would kill people, but the servers. But he said things like this: beauty must be in the hospital if we are to do our duty to the sick. The tenderness, sweetness, kindness, and feeling of the home must be brought into the hospital to make it in every sense a veritable home. What a beautiful legacy of Hannah that her grandson did that. And if you think about it, Catholic hospitals here bought into that, but Catholic hospitals are worldwide. And so they took those same standards and extended them around the world. And so this man, Hannah's grandson, had a worldwide impact. Here's another son of Helene who also had a national impact. He was a lawyer in Cincinnati for 62 years, and one of the cases he argued before the Supreme Court was the case that cut the legs out from under the Prohibition movement. That was the Toomey liquor case. And he argued that successfully, and that brought about the end of Prohibition. And his death, the newspaper wrote of him, he was one of nature's noblemen, suave, gentle, and precise. He ever stood erect and firm for God and his country. In volunteering his services in that case, he was actuated by patriotism. Their daughter, Marguerite, she was a musician, piano performer and teacher, active in Cincinnati. And this is not her, but she was presented at court in 1910 because she was in London visiting her cousin. And this is the kind of dress you had to wear with like a 6-foot train, I think. Anyway, Queen Alexandra commented upon her as the gifted young American girl. Well, she was 40 at the time, but maybe she looked young. And Marguerite said it was a glorious and brilliant scene. She also got to attend the coronation of King George V the next year. Hannah's next daughter, Josephine, her husband was a diplomat who served in Tunisia and Constantinople, and they were there for 4 decades. And you might think, oh, what is a diplomat's wife, just sitting around in a foreign country? No, the diplomat's wife was crucial to the performance of the diplomat's duties. A lot of times the diplomat would be selected or continued in service based upon how able his wife was to do all the society functions that were required of the diplomat. So Josephine really served her country in the Foreign Service with her husband for 4 decades. Now, here's my favorite of all favorites. She's almost our last one, Annette Lawler Clark. She was the youngest of the daughters, and she married in 1859. The next year, her father died. They moved to San Francisco. Then her first child was born, but then her second and third children died, and then her husband died. So within 5 years, she had lost her husband, 2 sons, and her father, and was away from where she had been raised. She was in San Francisco. Luckily, her sister Emily was also there at the time. So I believe, my theory is that she sought consolation in church and met a great man, John Goddard Clark, whose father was a reverend there in San Francisco. And Annette plunged herself wholeheartedly into the Lord's work. They had 2 children of their own. This is her son, Will, here. So I like to call Annette president of everything. She was on so many boards and served as president, treasury, vice president of so many philanthropic causes. I find it hard to imagine. But she was president of an old ladies' home, as they called it, and she raised funds for a new building. And in her words, to God, we must give the glory that he, in his wise providence, has permitted us to be instruments in his hand to accomplish this noble work. But one old ladies' home wasn't enough. She also was president of the Lick Old Ladies' Home, which is a beautiful place, and she visited the ladies every Thursday and raised funds for them. And one resident said, "It's a heavenly home and no mistake." So here, she was creating these little mini utopias for these elderly women who had no way to support themselves, could go and have this beautiful place to live to the end of their lives. She was also very active VP of St. Luke's Hospital, her church hospital, but her most important work was the International Order of King's Daughters. They did homes for incurables, as they called them. We would call them nursing homes. And she was the state secretary for 17 years in California, and by secretary, it's president. That was the highest office that they had. So she was very instrumental in this amazing organization. Here's a whole bunch of other things she did. She was on the board of this orphanage during the 1906 earthquake. She was involved in the Red Cross after the earthquake in 1906. And she was part of the group that put this sundial in Golden Gate Park, which is still there. Oh, here she is. She was also an amazing public speaker. The newspaper wrote about her after one of her presentations. She reminded her hearers how Bishop Kipp had left behind him all that was dear to him of friendship and association to work for the church in this new Western land. Mrs. Clark, who came to California not long after, much later than the bishop, was a warm personal friend of his and spoke so tenderly and so feelingly of his noble character, his lofty purposes, and his great work, that many of the elder women, remembering all he had been to them, were moved to tears. Well, I like that quote because I think it applies to Annette too. She left all that was dear to her, her associations in Cincinnati, to go to the West and to plunge herself into good works there. And so I think she had a bond with that Bishop Kipp. Just a couple more people to go through. Annette's son that you saw in the picture before, he's in this picture with his violin. When he grew up, he was a very important figure in the fight against tuberculosis, which was huge during the first part of the 20th century. So he was the first director of the San Francisco Health Department's Tuberculosis Bureau, led that bureau for 16 years. He trained medical students on how to treat TB. And San Francisco at the time was kind of a center, a hub of knowing how to treat TB. They had built these special hospitals with cross ventilation, and so people would come from all over the country to learn how to treat TB from the people in San Francisco. So he was a very influential person in that regard. And now this is the last son of Hannah. Remember, she finally had a boy, and he was in the military. He was a cavalry guy, and during the Civil War he led the Cavalry Bureau, and then after the Civil War he was in charge of 2 forts on the New Mexico frontier, helping keep peace between settlers and natives. And he submitted plans at a couple different times during his career to the military, head of the military, to make improvements. So someone who was very brilliant and top of his field as well. So, wow, Hannah, she pretty much epitomizes this idea of legacy. These children of hers, the only one, Carolyn, who died, we don't know anything about, but Emily and Sarah and Henrietta, all the areas that they influenced the world for the better. So from coast to coast and abroad, Hannah's children and grandchildren lived out her legacy using their talents to benefit society. I made this little map of all the boatloaders and the influence they had. And if you count them up, it's 5 continents that they influenced after they left here or their descendants went to. So they came to New Harmony to find utopia. Whether they stayed or left, they and their descendants inched the world closer to that goal of a better world. And we'll let Emily, the oldest daughter, who was 4.5 on the keel boat, we'll let her sum it up. She wrote to her cousin, James, "I rejoice to hear of your welfare and that your children are worthy of their ancestry and helping to make the world better by precept and example. No man or woman has lived in vain who leaves the world the better for his or her presence in it." Thank you. All right, any questions?
No questions?
I'll be around for a while, and I do have my Destination Harmony book, if you'd like to buy that. Yes?
Is that hotel still open in St. Augustine?
No, it was raised in the 60s, so no longer there, unfortunately. Yeah.
You mentioned your favorite. What were a couple of the surprises that really stood out to you as you were doing this research?
Just so many surprises. You know, I would just be like, what? He did that and she did that. And just finding things like you can look and find the proposals that that last son of Hannah's did to improve the military. And but I really love all the things that Annette did. And the whole idea, I didn't know about homes for incurables, and then they had homes for women. So like San Francisco, like women could be trafficked very easily there. And so it was a big deal to have homes where the young women, like the French Union, where women could go and be safe and could be put into employment that was safe, you know, so they worked on that. So just finding out, I loved finding out about San Francisco at that time, and it was really a huge place for philanthropy led by women, and Annette Clark was like right in there. And then I got to connect with her, one of her descendants, and that's who I got those pictures from, and I mean, that was great. Other questions?
I'm always curious to know with like writers and historians,
Yeah. Well, for this one, I did get out the roll of freezer paper, and it was what I did on New Year's Eve, whatever year that was. So I spread out the freezer paper on my dining room table, and I mapped it out with, the story arc and, ups and downs, and then I wrote in the internal and the external conflicts and, and all that. But for a long time before that, I had been taking notes, so I knew the progression of what was happening in the community. So I was making Sally's her own journey match the journey of the community. So that was kind of fun to do that.
What caused you to become interested in this to begin with?
Yeah, I'm an English teacher, and I was teaching my high school literature class about utopian literature, and then we looked at historic utopias, and we looked at Oneida Community, and this one, and the Shakers, and Amana colonies. So I wrote one book about the Oneida Community, and then this was my second one I wanted to look at. Mm-hmm. Other questions? All right, Ryan?
All right. If there's no more questions, I'm going to be lightning quick. Lena Feiner grant cycle is going to start again real soon. Last year's winner, 2024 recipient, Catherine Prater, she's going to be talking more about Lucy Say in her presentation. We don't have a date for that set yet, but you're going to hear more about that. Thank you so much for the Ephraimson Family Fund, and to Phyllis Feiner, and to the selection committee. That's Connie Weinzappel, Linda Warham, Dr. Annette Parks, Professor Jen Horn from USI, Jeannie Maudlin, and Melora Adams. They were the committee for 2023 and 24. Next week, we've got Kelly Morgan. She's going to be talking about Indigenous Earthworks of the Harmonious Cemetery. That's going to be Tuesday right here, 6:30. And also Wednesday, March 26th, University of Evansville Jazz Ensemble. We're going to have music right back here in the McClure room, 6:30 p.m. You don't want to miss that. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Let's give it up one more time for Rebecca.